Okay, so chapter 8 is going to talk about the kingdom Protista and the kingdom fungi, but we're going to start with the kingdom Protista. Okay, so what kind of classifies a protist? So first off, what you should know about the kingdom Protista, they are made up of eukaryotic organisms. However, they do not have much in common besides their relatively simple organisms. It is known as the miscellaneous kingdom or the misfit kingdom because protists are actually kind of just all thrown in there because they didn't classify as a fungi, plantae, or animalia. And so this is kind of the, let's just throw everything in there. We do see that we have tiny ones like an amoeba, all the way up to very large multicellular ones such as seaweed or what we know as algae. Protists can live in lots of different environments. However, most of them live in some environment that contains a high concentration of water. Protists, such as algae, are photosynthetic, while we have other protists, which are heterotrophic, because they're more animal-like. Another animal-like one would be like malaria, which would be parasitic. So protists are traditionally placed into these based on three similarities. They're either animal-like, plant-like, or fungus-like. And so those are going to be the things with it. Now, with these, they typically will have complex cilia or flagellum to help them move. They typically will reproduce sexually, but some do reproduce asexually. They have membrane-bound organelles because they are eukaryotic. You will see with all the kingdom Protista, they will have some multicellularity. They'll form either like a tissue, an organ, or organ system, but not all of them have organs, not all of them have organ systems. And so be aware that some of them are a little bit different because of that reason, but the kingdom Protista is kind of like the misfit kingdom for this. Okay, so reproduction for the kingdom Protista. They can reproduce either asexually or sexually. Now remember, there are 4 different types of asexual reproduction, and that is binary fission, budding, fragmentation, and parthenogenesis. However, we typically don't see parthenogenesis occur within this. The most common way for them to asexually reproduce is binary fission and budding, which is the process of mitosis. However, some of them will go through fragmentation. That means when one portion of it breaks off, a very large portion, they can develop into another species from there, or another organism, sorry. Protists will, though, go through sexual reproduction, not quite the way we think, but by fusing of gametes. So what happens is the gametes are released out into a water source, and when they come in contact with one another, then they fuse together to form a zygote. And so it's not really the most intimate way or effective, because if you don't have a female present and you release all your male gametes, they won't become fertilized. They will float for several days, some of them. Some of them are only good for a few minutes or hours. It depends on the species that we're talking about. But they do both. Now remember, we want to do genetic variation, and so protists will produce sexually for that reason, because you do want to have some genetic variation. And so we're going to go through asexual reproduction because it is the most common. So with this asexual reproduction, it occurs typically with binary fission and budding. So with binary fission, we also know this is mitosis. You have 2 genetically identical daughter cells that form from one parent cell. They are the same size. They have all the genetic information. They're exactly the same as the parent that started it. Budding is a little bit different. It still goes through the process of mitosis, but instead it's pinching off and forming a new organism, which is much, much smaller than the original organism. The original organism, or the parent cell, is still there and is very large compared to the offspring or daughter cell that forms. So it's not taking one and splitting it into 2, it's actually taking one and making another one off of that one. And fragmentation is like when you take an arm off of a starfish and it forms a brand new starfish from there. Now, these are just examples of this, just to remind you of binary fission. I'm not going to go through this, and budding. for the sexual reproduction for our protists. This is an evolutionary advancement for them. So protists that asexually reproduce are lower on the evolutionary trail than the protists that sexually reproduce. And so these sexual reproductions usually occur because of environmental stressor. If our organism is not in a perfect environment, it will seek out a mate so that their offspring have a little bit more genetic diversity, and so they can actually adapt and be able to live in the environment of which they're in. And so some of them, meaning protists, will actually go through asexual reproduction most of their lives until, oh, here's an environmental stressor, now I'm going to go through sexual reproduction. And basically it's because they want their offspring to live or be viable. And so we have that sexual reproduction for that reason. So remember that you have the fusion of two haploid gametes in there. So on the path of sexual reproduction for multicellular protists, again, both of them, we have a process called alteration of generations, which consists of two different methods of reproduction. One of them is going to produce a sporophyte, which is a diploid spore. This is usually produced in the years that they're just finding asexual reproduction. And then they have a gametophyte generation. The gametophyte, or gamete, is produced. And when the gamete or the haploid cell is produced, it will seek out another haploid cell to become fertilized to make a diploid offspring. The spores, or the sporophyte generation, those spore producing can land and then they can produce a whole organism from there. We'll typically see these in the plant-like protists. They'll go through this alteration of generation. We also see this as an alteration generation that occurs within plants as well. And so we have our that brings us to our three classifications of protists. So protists, again, we said we're the misfit categories. The reason that they're in this kingdom is because we can't put them into any other kingdom. And we didn't really have that many in the kingdom Protista until we started doing DNA research. Once we started doing the genomes, or mapping, of the organisms, we found out that in the kingdom Protista, we had a lot of species put in there that weren't normally in there. And so we've actually, within the last 20 years, had a lot of plants move over to Protista, animals, and fungi. And basically, these provide a little bit of evolutionary evidence. So the first eukaryotic cells, which we know to be formed through the endosymbiotic theory, we feel were formed and wake up the organisms found in the kingdom Protista. And so the members of this kingdom give the first evidence to our endosymbiotic theory. We see that the mitochondria and the chloroplasts have different DNA from the nucleus, and there's a lot more DNA in the mitochondria and chloroplasts in Protista. We typically see that they'll go through a process known as binary fission and still produce the separate DNA in the mitochondria and the chloroplasts, and the biochemistry of them are very similar to what we know as cyanobacteria for a lot of the organisms in this kingdom, and that is a huge evolutionary step for this. And so when we start talking about Protista, remember they are kind of the misfit one, and they do not fit perfectly into any of the categories. And so let's talk about the groups for the kingdom Protista. So basically, grouping Protista is obtained by how they're getting their food. So what is their ecological role and how are they getting their nutrients? So Protista are usually plant-like, which get their energy through photosynthesis. Animal-like, which are able to get their energy from capturing or eating other organisms, which means they're heterotrophs. And then we have fungus-like, which are able to decompose and absorb their nutrients from the environment. Again, another type of heterotroph. And so those are the three main groups of Protista. So let's talk about animal-like Protista, also known as protozoan. And so most of the organisms in protozoan are typically going to be single cellular. They are heterotrophic. They are capable of moving through either cilia or flagellum. And the protozoans are not animals. These animal-like protists, also known as protozoa, are not animals. They are ancient ancestors of them or have some really distinct qualities from them, but they are not considered to be animals. And they will typically feed by engulfing their food source, which means they pretty much open their mouths and go around it. And so an amoeboid protist would be an example of that. They are able to engulf their food. They move through an extension called a pseudopoda, which is known as a false foot. And pseudopoda will extend, and it allows them also to catch their prey, so they're able to engulf it, kind of like a big Pac-Man mouth, and they'll engulf around it. And so they're able to take a lot of those in. So amoeboids are one of those really cool ones. Ciliates are another one. Cilia, which you see is the little finger-like projections, are how they move. And so ciliates are a little bit more complex. These hair-like projections are what they give them their name, and they're called cilia. They're able to move freely because of these cilia, and they are hunters. And so they are going to hunt for their food source and to find all of them. They're typically found in fresh and seawater. Unlike amoeboids can go into the human body and actually make you super sick and become parasitic. Ciliates are typically not, but we have found them to be. Then we have flagellates. Flagellates are also getting their name similar to ciliates because of the flagellum that they have coming out the end of the body. They are parasitic. And so a lot of these flagellates will have some type of disease that accompanies them. Trichomonas, which is a STD, you can also be spread through diseased water, is a little flagellate that will actually swim into the urethra for males and into the vagina for females and cause huge problems. And it is actually considered to be an STD because it can be transmitted through sex. And so you actually have these flagellates coming up through your urethral tracts and causing a lot of problems. And so they are typically parasitic, and they can be problematic and cause death in young people, old people, and those with immune deficiencies. Then we have our last type. These are the sporozoans. The sporozoans, these are protists-like that have spore cells. They reproduce, and that's how they get their name, is through sporozoan. They lack any cilia, flagellum, or pseudopoda. They are parasitic, and they do cause disease. However, they're not able to move on their own. And so because they're not able to move on their own, this is why they have to be parasitic. The host has to be able to move them, and there's some really cool diseases that they actually do form, and so there are some neat ones.